Stalin section. Perfect Symmetries and Self-Absolution. Stalin's Anti-Semitism. For however sophisticated the game of analogies may be, the construction of the myth of the two twin monsters doesn't appear to be completed quite yet. Despite the efforts to make the Ukrainian Holodomor correspond to the Jewish Holocaust, in the consciousness of our time, the name Auschwitz causes an entirely unique horror. Maybe the association of Stalin to Hitler could be considered definitive if the former was affected by the madness that led to the Judeocide carried out by the latter. Khrushchev recalls that, towards the end of his life, Stalin had suspicions that the doctors who treated the country's leaders were in fact participants in an imperialist conspiracy that aimed at decapitating the Soviet Union. The secret report doesn't mention it, but there was no small number of Jews among the doctors under suspicion. And from there, one can begin adding some depth to the portrait of the Soviet monster with a new and decisive detail. Quote, "The deep anti-Semitism of Stalin and his followers," Medvedev declares, "was not a secret to anyone." End quote. On the, quote, "official anti-Semitism of the Soviet state," Hobsbawm specifies, "there are undeniable vestiges since the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948. End quote. The American historian on ethnic cleansing and racial hatred that we've already encountered goes a bit further back. Quote, "By the end of the war, Stalin had shared many aspects of Hitler's anti-Semitism." End quote. Furet goes even further. Quote, "Since the start of Hitlerism, Stalin never showed the most minimal compassion for Jews." End quote. Naturally, conquest is the most radical of them all. Quote, "Always latent in Stalin's spirit, the anti-Semitism began to show in full force starting from 1942 to 43, till becoming generalized in 1948. End quote. It's at this point that the construction of the myth of the two twin monsters can be considered completed. Before analyzing the extreme fragility of that construction, it ought to be noted that it's simultaneously useful in repressing the West's serious responsibility in the tragedy that the Jews suffer in the 20th century. It's a tragedy with 3 acts and a prologue. In 1911, Chamberlain's book, The Foundations of the 19th Century, is translated into English, entirely dedicated to reading world history from a racial perspective, Aryan and anti-Semitic. Now it can be truly understood the leading role played by the Anglo-German author as the maître à penser of Nazism. Especially exalted in tone is Goebbels, who, upon seeing him sick and bedridden, offers a prayer of sorts. Quote, "Good health to you, father of our spirit, precursor, pioneer." End quote. In no less inspired terms, Chamberlain, in turn, sees in Hitler a type of savior, and not just for Germany. After seizing power, and while passionately absorbed in the task of leading the war that he has unleashed, the Führer warmly recalls the encouragement that Chamberlain offered to him during his time in prison. So, how is this work, which was crucial to the Nazi worldview and racial ideology, received in the West? In Britain, the reaction from the press is enthusiastic, beginning with The Times, which endlessly applauds the masterpiece and praises it as, quote, "one of the rare books that has some importance." On the other side of the Atlantic, the review by an authoritative statesman like Theodore Roosevelt is overwhelmingly positive. On the opposing side, it's Kautsky, who expresses his full disdain for Chamberlain and other racial theorists. At that time, before the start of the war, Kautsky is venerated as a maestro to the workers' movement and the socialist movement as a whole, including by Stalin. The latter, in 1907, defines the German author as a, quote, "distinguished theorist of social democracy." due in part to his contribution to the analysis and the denunciation of anti-Semitism and the pogroms against Jews in Tsarist Russia. Now let's turn to the first act of the tragedy. It unfolds in pre-revolutionary Russia, an ally of the Entente during World War I. Discriminated against and oppressed, the Jews are suspected of sympathizing with the enemy and the German invader. The Russian General Staff warns of their espionage activities. Some are kept as hostages and threatened with execution should the Jewish community show a lack of patriotic loyalty. Alleged spies are executed. That's not all. At the start of 1915, in the areas attacked by the German army, a mass deportation is ordered. A representative in the Duma describes the details of the operation as follows. In Radom at 11 p.m. Beginning of long quote. The population is informed that it must leave the city under the threat that anyone found by dawn will be hanged. Due to the lack of means of transportation, the elderly and the disabled must be carried out by hand. Police and soldiers treat the Jews as criminals. In one case, a train was completely sealed shut, and when it's finally reopened, most of those inside were dying. Of the 500,000 Jews subjected to deportation measures, 100,000 didn't survive. End quote. The October Revolution breaks out in the wake of the struggle against the war and the horrors that accompany it. It's inspired by Marx and Engels, who had written in the middle of the 19th century, quote, "The times of superstition have passed, when revolution was blamed on the subversion of a handful of agitators." End quote. Unfortunately, it's a prediction that was catastrophically mistaken. The rise to power in Russia of a movement that's inspired by, quote, Marx the Jew, and has a strong Jewish presence in its leadership, inaugurates the age in which the conspiracy theory celebrates its triumph. In a Russia torn apart by civil war, pogroms and massacres against Jews, considered to be those controlling Bolshevism, are the order of the day. The new Soviet power is committed to stopping this horror. Tough new laws are issued, and Lenin demands the elimination, quote, of hostility against Jews and the hatred of other nations, end quote, during a speech that's recorded so that it can reach millions of illiterate people. Britain, France, and the United States remained on the side of the whites, and at times they actively participated in the bloody anti-Semitic agitation. In the summer of 1918, the British forces that land in northern Russia distributed anti-Semitic flyers by air on a massive scale. Some months later, pogroms of a tremendous dimension take place in which around 70,000 Jews lost their lives. Quote, "They say that the Allies, then concentrated on their invasion of Russia, had secretly supported the pogroms." End quote. It's a preview, authoritative historians observe, to the crimes of Nazism and the extermination during World War II. And it's a preview that sees active British participation, leading the anti-Bolshevik crusade at that time. We thus arrive at the third act. Despite Western aid, the whites are defeated by the Bolsheviks and emigrate to the West, bringing with them the denunciation of the October Revolution as a Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy, and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion confirm that understanding beyond any doubt. All of this doesn't come without consequences. In England, the official publishers of His Majesty print the English edition of the Protocols, soon after cited by the Times as the proof of a secret plot that was threatening the West. It then develops into a campaign to which Winston Churchill is no stranger, who takes part in denouncing the role of Judaism, not only in Russia, but in the whole cycle of subversion that, starting in the 18th century, had shaken the West. Beginning of long quote. This movement among Jews is not new. it has grown since the days of Spartacus Weishaupt, the Bavarian Illuminati, until the days of Karl Marx, and later Trotsky, Russia, Bela Kun, Hungary, Rosa Luxemburg, Germany, and Emma Goldman, United States. This world conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the transformation of society into one based on restricted development, on a wicked jealousy, and on an impossible equality. As has been wisely demonstrated by a contemporary author, Mr. Webster, this movement had a leading role in the tragedy of the French Revolution. It constituted the motor behind all subversive tendencies in the 19th century. And now that band of extraordinary personalities, coming out of the slums of the major European and American cities, have grabbed the Russian people by the neck, and in practice have become the undeniable masters of a powerful state. End quote. As late as 1937, while expressing a positive opinion on Hitler, Churchill incessantly stresses the Jewish origins of a central leader of Bolshevik Russia, that is, quote, Trotsky, also known as Lev Bronstein. Yes, quote, he had always been a Jew. Nothing could wipe out that characteristic. End quote. On the other side of the Atlantic, it's Henry Ford who encourages the promotion of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Ford declares, quote, "The Russian Revolution has a racial origin, not a political one, and it, in making use of humanitarian and socialist slogans, in reality expresses a racial aspiration for world domination." End quote. Aside from the American auto industry tycoon, it's the champions of white supremacy who stand out the most for their denunciation of the hidden Jewish control of the revolutionary movement. That's, after having overthrown the Tsar's regime, undermining the foundations of the West. Madison Grant warns of the Semitic leadership over Bolshevism, and Lothrop Stoddard classifies the Bolshevik regime of Soviet Russia as largely Jewish. Stoddard becomes the author of reference to 2 American presidents. In this climate, voices arise in the North American Republic that call for radical measures with the aim of confronting, quote, Jewish imperialism and its ultimate objective of establishing Jewish domination over the world, end quote. A hard fate, even more threatening voices rage, awaits the people responsible for this vile project. They suggest, quote, massacres of Jews, such that were considered unthinkable until now, therefore of an unprecedented scale in modern times, end quote. Reading these recurring convictions in Churchill, Ford, and the other American authors cited above, we are led to think of the anti-Semitic agitation carried in even more inflammatory tones by the Nazis. From the anti-Bolshevik emigration, they find not only ideas, but also the financial means, as well as an important number of militants and personnel. One only has to think of Rosenberg as one of the major figures who defines the October Revolution as a Jewish conspiracy. As one can see from its start, the tragedy of the Jewish people in the 20th century has the active participation of the liberal West, and both pre-revolutionary and counter-revolutionary Russia. All of that is wiped out by the accusation of anti-Semitism directed at the person who had for more time than any other led the country that emerged from the October Revolution, or the, quote, Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. End section.